You know what the most worthless thing in the world is? No, it's not the Venezuelan Bolivar, it's not Taylor Swift's music, although it's pretty close, and certainly is not the US dollar, although it has seen better days. No, Jimmy! The most worthless thing in the world is the Geneva Convention. Because no one actually follows it! The Geneva Convention? You mean more like the Geneva Suggestion? Let's start in chronological order with the war crimes committed by our beloved knights in shining armor, the US Army. Let's start with the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. Now granted, at that time there was no such concept of war crimes, so I'll ignore all the bombardment of the civilian population in the city of Veracruz, the bombardment and looting of Catholic churches, or all the mass rape. But there's a special kind of evil in a certain man that rose to prominence during, but most notoriously, shortly after the war had ended. I'm talking about John Joel Glanton, a former Texas Ranger and soldier during the Mexican-American War. He formed the Glanton Organization, and he was hired by the Mexican authorities when Mexico was basically in ruins after the end of the war to hunt down the native Apaches that terrorized the Mexican civilian population after the war had ended. And for an increased income, the Mexican authorities demanded that they bring the scalps of those Apaches. Glanton and his employees took the liberty to murder, rape, pillage and collect the scalps of Mexican civilians, more than the actual Apaches they were employed to hunt down. Cormac McCarthy wrote this masterpiece of a book based on this true event, the Glanton Massacre, called Blood Meridian. If you haven't read this book, remedy this ASAP Rocky! Now let's move forward to see what the US Army did during the Philippine-American War from 1899 to 1802. The constant attacks on the American garrison by the locals resulting in uprisings everywhere, showing that it wasn't a successful pacifying campaign, and this conflicted with the official narrative. American generals weren't pleased with those reports and implemented genocidal tactics used back home on the American mainland against the Apache tribes. Army Brigadier General Samuel Young advocated to concentrate the local population into towns and camps, therefore coined the term concentration camp. The American soldiers burned the crops, destroying fishing boats, shoot farm animals, and defiant civilians who didn't comply. Of course, the local population wasn't so happy about this, and they continued to attack and caused riots against the occupying American garrison. The US Army General Jacob Smith issued a direct order to crush any resistance on the island of Samal. Quote, "I want no prisoners. I wish you to kill and burn. The more you kill and burn, the better it will please me. The interior of Samal must be made a howling wilderness, and to kill all the males older than 10 years. End quote. What a nice guy! Army General Franklin Bell told the press, quote, "I can't say how long it will take to make a wilderness out of that country, but it will eventually take place." End quote. He later launched 44 expeditions to, quote, "shoot and burn anything of value." In just one expedition, they burned 500 tons of corn and rice, hundreds of hogs and chicken, 6,000 houses, 800 cattle, and 600 horses. Not bad! Often, American soldiers used water torture to extract information from local mayors and priests. Filipino historians say there were roughly 50,000 killed with these types of methods, and many more died of famine and plagues. The San Francisco Argonaut, a Californian newspaper, wrote the following article: "We did not want the Filipinos, we wanted the Philippines." Those islands are incredibly rich, but unfortunately are infested with Filipinos. End quote. Such nice people! The Haitian occupation from 1915 to 1934, where reported 15,000 civilians killed during the 19 years of occupation. There isn't much information about the Haitian occupation, but you can fill in the blanks. Now let's move to World War II. There are too many war crimes, rapes, bombings of hospitals, field hospitals, so I'll go rapid fire, no pun intended, through World War II. The Shenonia Massacre, where 80 surrendering German troops were murdered by the 11th Armored Division of the US Army. General Patton himself, as you see from this letter, tried to cover it up, but it was declassified by Dwight D. Eisenhower along with thousands of others. The Dachau Massacre. Side note, on Wikipedia it is titled the Dachau Liberation Reprisals. Yeah, it's all about how you use those words for propaganda. It was covered up, of course, like all their war crimes, and it didn't see the light of day up until 1991. The rape of Dresden and also the carpet bombing of Dresden. World War II? Yeah, more like the rape of Europe. The rape of Okinawa and Kanagawa, where there were more than 12,000 rape cases reported. Fine gentlemen, those American soldiers, don't you agree? If you thought that was bad, it gets much worse. The Korean War. For 3 years, the US Air Force held a carpet bombing campaign over North Korea. For those of you who don't know, the term carpet bombing means indiscriminatory bombing. So it doesn't matter if it's civilian buildings, hospitals, schools, kindergartens, or your local Popeyes, they bomb everything! Up until 2001, the number of victims was unknown, but Chosun Daily, a newspaper in South Korea, gathered that approximately 280,000 civilians were killed in the carpet bombing campaign. Oh, and also I should mention the No-gun-ri massacre, where US soldiers of the 7th Cavalry Regiment killed roughly 300 to 500 women, children, and elders. But what makes this different from the other war crimes is that those were South Korean refugees. I mean, okay, you have something with the guys in the north, okay, I get it, they're commies, okay, but those were your allies! I mean, why? Now we get to the really dark stuff, and that is the Vietnam War. It ain't me! It ain't me! I ain't no fortunate son, no! Goddamn, YouTube doesn't let me play this song because of copyright issues. When you establish free fire zones, you know you're not the good guy, bro, okay? You're not the good guy. When the Pentagon sets up a task force entitled Vietnam War Crimes Working Group to keep yourself in check, you know you're not the good guy. Now, I should mention that this task force compiled more than 9,000 pages of investigative files, sworn statements by the witnesses, and status reports for top military officials. The My Lai massacre, where there were more than 500 civilians murdered, including gang rape of women and children as young as 12. And they also mutilated their bodies. Operation Speedy Express, or more known as Mekong Delta. Also, there's a pretty cool thrash metal band with the same name, where the US Army used their massive firepower to indiscriminately kill roughly between 5,000 to 7,000 civilians. The Phoenix program was a coordinated CIA operation used for extracting information from prisoners of war, civilians. Most notoriously, they used the famous technique of water torture. The Tiger Force was a long-range reconnaissance unit of the 1st Battalion Airborne Infantry, notorious for intentionally killing civilians using long-range snipers. Those kinds of war crimes are too many to count, but now I want to direct your attention towards the chemical warfare part, and I want to talk about the infamous use of napalm.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
Side note, napalm was invented by the Allied forces during World War II and also used against the German forces in the European theater in World War II during the siege of La Rochelle, and also used by the Allied forces in the Pacific theater in Saipan, Okinawa, and the Philippines. Remember, kids, always accuse your enemies of what you are guilty of. In Vietnam, the US Army used napalm to torch the rice fields, jungles, railroad tunnels, even civilians, of course. In total, since 1963 to 1973, the US Army used 352,000 tons of napalm in Vietnam. Also, in Cambodia, under the direct order of Henry Kissinger, a figure I made a whole video about that nobody watched, check it out after you watch this video. The US Air Force dropped 2.7 million tons of bombs on Cambodia alone. Many of those bombs never actually detonated, making Cambodia the largest minefield in the world. Now I wanna talk about Agent Orange. And no, I'm not talking about the thrash metal masterpiece by the Teutonic Titan Sodom on my t-shirt. No, I'm talking about the chemical herbicide and defoliant Agent Orange used by the US Army during the Vietnam War. In my humble opinion, this is the most insidious and malevolent war crime the US Army ever committed. And that says a lot! Agent Orange was used to destroy crops, jungles, forests, not only in Vietnam but also Laos and Cambodia for 10 years between 1961 to 1971. Those herbicides were manufactured by the Monsanto Company. Fun fact, the Monsanto Company was bought in 2018 by Bayer, the same company that produced the COVID-19 jab in Europe. You think they have your best intentions in mind? Yeah, think again, dummy. Ever since the massive use of Agent Orange as a chemical weapon in the Indochina theater, since then more than 6% of all the children in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were born with horrific birth defects, and millions of people developed cancer-related diseases like lung cancer, prostate cancer, Hodgkin's lymphoma, multiple myeloma, soft tissue sarcomas, and severe psychological and neurological problems. The US Army used more than 20 million gallons of Agent Orange. In 1979, a lawsuit was filed on behalf of 2.4 million Vietnam veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange. And 5 years later, those 7 companies that manufactured Agent Orange agreed to pay $180 million fund to aid Agent Orange victims. In 2004, a group of Vietnamese citizens filed a class action lawsuit against those chemical companies. The suit sought billions of dollars worth of damages, and of course, in 2005, a federal judge from New York dismissed this lawsuit. His name? Jack Bertrand Weinstein! Buddy, when I'm telling you every damn time, it is every damn time! The US government refuses to this day to compensate the Vietnamese victims because in order to do so, they would admit they committed war crimes during the Vietnam War. Bro, I'm telling you, you don't hate Big Pharma enough! Now, let's move to a more uplifting topic, like, let's say, the Iraq War. The war that was based on a false pretense that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons. Spoiler alert! He didn't have any! Now, I'm not gonna state every single incident where they bombed civilian buildings, hospitals, schools, and whatnot, because we're gonna be here all day. Summarized, more than 1.1 million civilians were killed directly or indirectly by the US Army. Now, let's talk about something spicy, like, let's say, the Abu Ghraib torture prisoner abuse facility. And hopefully YouTube won't flag my video for graphic content. US soldiers used physical abuse, sexual humiliation, physical and psychological torture, desecration of corpses, and fecal matter smearing torture. The Bush administration claimed that those were just isolated cases and were not government policy. Oh, really? So 63 separate cases that were brought to the international court are isolated cases? Do you see how easy they lie? It's like second nature to them. The Abu Ghraib prison occupied over 32 square kilometers, or 20 square miles for my American audience, and held more than 50,000 men and women in poor conditions where torture and executions were frequent. And now let's talk about the most expensive war in the 21st century. Up until now, I mean. That costed more than $2.3 trillion, and that is, of course, the Afghanistan War. Now, I want to say a controversial statement, but what's new on this channel, am I right? Compared to the Iraq War, the Vietnam War, the carpet bombings of Laos and Cambodia, World War II on the Pacific theater and the European theater, the Philippines War and the Mexico War, the US Army was actually really tame in Afghanistan compared to the previous war crimes they committed. I mean, they did torture two unarmed civilians in 2002 at the Bagram Theater internment facility. They murdered a few civilians. They committed the Kandahar massacre in 2012. They bombed the Kunduz hospital, and they frequently used white phosphorus. But other than that, there isn't much information about what the US Army did in Afghanistan. But just like the other wars, the truth often comes when the dust settles and the fog of war is lifted. But when you have this propaganda behemoth like Hollywood, the American media, and government censorship, the truth is often revealed when no one else is interested in it. Remember, kids, always accuse your enemy of what which you are guilty yourself.
Subscribe, you silly Billy!